I am reading from Rockefeller Medicine, Medicine and Capitalism in America, published 1979 by E. Richard Brown. Introduction. The crisis in today's healthcare system is deeply rooted in the interwoven history of modern medicine and corporate capitalism. The major groups and forces that shape the medical system sowed the seeds of the crisis we now face in 1979. The medical profession and other medical interest groups each tried to make medicine serve their own narrow economic and social interests. Foundations and their other corporate class institutions insisted that medicine serve the need of their corporate capitalist society. The dialectic of their common efforts and their clashes and the economic and political forces set in motion by their actions shaped the system as it grew. Out of this history emerged a medical system that poorly served society's health needs. The system's most obvious problems are the cost, inflation, and inaccessibility of medical care in the United States. Total health care expenditures in this country topped $200 billion in 1979, nearly 1,000 for every woman, man, and child. Far more of society's resources go into medical expenditures than ever before. Twice the portion of the gross national product was spent on medical care in 1980 than in 1950. We pay for these costs through taxes, health insurance premiums, and directly out of our pockets. Public expenditures, 4 out of every $10 spent on personal health services, come out of our taxes. Private health insurance and direct out-of-pocket payments each account for about 3 out of every $10. No matter what form it takes, the entire $200 billion originates in the labor of men and women in the society. President Carter estimated that the average American worker works 1 month each year just to pay the cost of the medical system. Most people feel that they should be getting a lot more for this money, but instead they find that it's difficult to even get a care they need. Primary care physicians, general practitioners, pediatricians, internists, and gynecologists are scarce. Doctors and hospitals are clustered in the better parts of our cities and largely absent from the poorer sections and rural areas of our country. For the millions of Americans covered by Medicaid, the government subsidy program for public assistance linked poor, the coverage has been as sparse and degrading and as the demeaning clinics it was supposed to replace. The middle class and the poor share at least long waiting periods for doctors, one of the most common constraints on the accessibility of physicians. Instead of creating a humane and accessible Medicare system, Medicare and Medicaid have helped fuel inflation and medical costs by dumping new funds into a privately controlled system ready to absorb every penny into expansion, technology, high salaries, and profits. A second, somewhat less widely discussed problem is the relatively small impact medical care makes on the population's health status. Despite a plethora of diagnostic procedures, drugs, and surgical techniques, we are not as healthy as we believe these medical wonders would make us. Some critics, like social philosopher Ivan Ilyich, accuse medicine of making us sicker physically, politically, and culturally than we would be without it. Many analysts have documented the medical profession's social control functions. Medical technologies frequently adverse effects on our health, and medicine's neglect of important physical and social environmental influences on our health. Instead of medicine liberating us from the suffering and dependency of illness, we find that its oppressive elements have grown at least as rapidly as its technical achievements. Why has medical care grown so costly so rapidly? Why is it so plentiful and yet so inaccessible? How did medicine become technically so sophisticated but remain socially unconcerned and even repressive? A popular but too facile answer is that such problems are characteristic of technology and industrialized societies. According to this argument, technology and industrialization impose their own limits on forms of social organization and produce similar kinds of problems that call forth similar solutions. Medical sociologist David Mechanic finds problems of cost, organization, and ethical dilemmas in medicine widespread among industrialized countries and concludes that demands of medical technology and the growth of the science base of medical activity produce pressures towards common organizational solutions despite strong ideological differences. Ilyich asserts that pathogenic medicine is the result of industrial overproduction. In this view, technology has a life of its own, imposing its imperatives on individuals and social organization. By focusing on widespread patterns of industrial organization and technological development, these analysts conclude that technology and industrialization are universal determining forces. Such technological determinism ignores the particular history in which society and technology interact. In the Marxian view, technology and economic organization constantly shape each other in a dialectical process. Individuals and groups who own those resources and control the organization of the production, far from being at the mercy of neutral technology, introduce innovations that serve their own ends and oppose those that would serve other interests than their own. These innovations may neglect broader community needs and may hurt the needs of others. Machines and factories undermine the autonomy and even the economic existence of independent craft workers. Hospitals and their expensive equipment may tie many health workers to monotonous jobs and use funds that might otherwise go for far more widely distributed community clinics. Those affected by these technological developments may resist them and force their modification. Workers may organize into unions and gain some control over the relations of production. Communities may organize to block hospital expansion and force development of more community-based clinics. In sum, the political economic organization of society generates certain types of technological innovation and not others, and these innovations generate new social forces that modify technology and political economic relations. This book sees scientific technological medicine not as the determining force in the development of modern healthcare, but as a tool developed by members of the medical profession and the corporate class to serve their perceived needs. Individuals and groups who possess needed resources can apply them to develop certain types of technological innovation in medicine. Those who have the requisite resources can also apply the resulting technological innovation to serve their economic and social needs. In the United States, medicine came of age during the same period that corporations grew to dominate the larger economy. As corporate capitalism developed, it altered many institutions in the society, medicine among them. Its influence was created not simply through cultural assimilation or the demands of industrial organization, but by persons who acted in its behalf. This interpretation does not suggest that history is made by dark conspiracies. Rather, it argues that the class that disproportionately owns, directs, and profits from the dominant economic system will disproportionately influence the other spheres of social relations as well. Members of the corporate class, including those who own substantial shares of corporate wealth, as well as the top managers of major corporate institutions, naturally try to ensure the survival of capitalist society and their own positions in its social structure. In the case of medicine, members of the corporate class, acting mainly through philanthropic foundations, articulated a strategy for developing a medical system to meet the needs of capitalist society. They believed their goals for medicine would benefit the society as a whole, just as they believe that the private accumulation of wealth and private decisions about how to use that wealth and its income were in the best interest of society. In this book, we will examine strategies developed during the Progressive Era and the reasons for their actions, leaning heavily on the public and private thoughts of some persons centrally involved in these efforts. We will describe and analyze the interests and strategies of the medical profession and of the corporate class as they develop independently, coalesced, and then clashed. We will also see that the government has increasingly taken over the strategies and struggles begun by the corporate class. The corporate class influenced medicine, but it could not control it absolutely. The market system in medical care provides special interest groups today, including doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, drug companies, and medical supply and equipment companies, with the opportunity to develop their own bases of economic power, enabling them to carve out and defend their turfs in the marketplace. The larger business class stands above these interest groups, trying to tame and coordinate the Leviathan, but nonetheless committed to private ownership and control, and also enjoying medicine's legitimizing and cultural functions. The relationships and contradictions that emerged among the corporate class in these medical interest groups profoundly influence the organization and content of today's medical systems. Doctors. From our vantage point today, it is difficult to believe that in the late 19th century, the medical profession lacked power, wealth, and status. Medicine at the time was pluralistic in its theories of disease, technically ineffective in preventing or curing sickness, and divided into several warring sects. Existing professional organizations had virtually no control over the entry of new doctors into the field. Physicians as a group were merely scattered members of a lower professional stratum, earning from several hundred to several $1,000s per year and having no special status within the population. By the 1930s, however, medicine was firmly in the hands of an organized profession that controlled entry into the field through licensure and accreditation of medical schools and teaching hospitals. The profession also controlled the practice and economics of medicine through local medical societies. Medicine had come to mean the field of clinical practice by graduates of schools that followed the scientific, clinical, and research orientations laid down by the American Medical Association and by Abraham Flexner in a famous report for the Carnegie Foundation. All other healers were being excluded from practice. Physicians were increasingly drawn only from the middle and upper classes. The median net income for non-salaried physicians in 1929 was $3,758, above the average for college teachers, but below the faculty at Yale University and below the average for mechanical engineers. Overall, doctors were rapidly rising in income, power, and status among all occupational groups. In the 1970s, physicians have continued the climb to the top rungs of America's class structure. The median net income of office-based physicians was $63,000 in 1976, just 3 years prior to this book being written. That places them in the top few percentiles of society's income structure. In 1939, the average earnings of doctors were 2.5 times as great as those of other full-time workers. But by 1976, that gap had increased to 5.5 times. Doctors rank with Supreme Court justices at the top of the occupational status hierarchy. And in recent public opinion polls, more Americans said they trusted the medical profession than any other American institution, including higher education, government, of course, and organized religion. On a side note, I would venture to say that has rapidly decreased considering what has occurred over the last year with the coronavirus pandemic. Rising productivity has been an important factor in physicians' efforts to raise their incomes, status, and power. The medical profession has drastically controlled the production of new physicians and has delegated to technicians and paraprofessionals below them the tasks they no longer find interesting or profitable. With rapidly expanding medical technology, more and more tasks were shifted down the line to a burgeoning health workforce. At the beginning of this century, 2 out of every 3 health workers were physicians. Of the more than 4.7 million health workers today, in 1979, only 1 in 12 is a physician. Thus, doctors have increasingly become the managers of patient care rather than the direct providers of it. And another side note, this was back in 1979, so that has only accelerated and increased since then. Everybody has experience basically going to a doctor with a legitimate concern or an issue, and you're in and out of there, and usually not even seen by the doctor, or you're usually with an assistant who will then obligatory give you the x-ray and then give you some type of prescription and then send you on your way, only to come back in like 2 or 3 weeks to get the next copay. But it's all transactional. It's only it lacks empathy, and basically you're in and you're out. It's burn and churn on to the next one. As they say in this book, it was all about production once the corporations kind of took control of the culture. Back to it. As medical managers, physicians have found themselves drawn out of private practice into employment in hospitals, research, teaching, government, and other institutions. Today, 4 in 10 doctors are employed in such institutions, compared with 1 in 10 in 1931. These physicians have had fewer material interests in common with private practitioners and have shown little political support for the AMA. Physicians entered a struggle to maintain their position at the top of the medical hierarchy soon after the position was won. The challenge was not, for the most part, come from below, except for recent attempts by nurses to increase their authority in patient care. Doctors have found themselves in a struggle with hospitals, insurance companies, medical schools, foundations, government health agencies, and other groups with an interest in a more rationalized health system, one in which the parts are more coordinated hierarchically and horizontally, and in which more emphasis is given to capital-intensive services. The conflict has emerged between organized practitioners as one interest group, what Robert Alford calls professional monopolizers, and all the groups seeking to systemize healthcare according to bureaucratic and business principles of organization, what Alford calls corporate rationalizers. In challenging the power of organized medicine to protect its interests, hospitals, particularly through American Hospital Association, the AHA, have tried to appear the logical center of any rationalized health system. In their transformation and growth from asylums for the sick and dying poor to their 20th century role as the physician's workshop, hospitals developed a powerful position in modern healthcare as a major locus of medical technology. Because of physicians' growing reliance on technology, hospitals were absorbing and increasing shares of dollars spent on medical care. Public and private health insurance, really medical care insurance, developed as a stable source of income, enabling hospitals to expand their facilities. Collectively, hospitals have become a major force in the medical system, consuming 40% of the nation's annual healthcare expenditures. Blue Cross and Blue Shield, created in the 1930s and 40s by hospital associations and medical societies, respectively, together with commercial insurance companies, now control 30% of medical care expenditures, mostly emphasizing hospital-based technical care. They have developed economic and political clout commensurate with their dominating fiscal role. While the insurance industry is a new voice in the chorus of corporate rationalizers, medical schools have been in the vanguard of more than a half century. Although run by physicians for the reproduction of health professionals and as the research and development arm of the medical industry, medical schools' interests have often conflicted with the interest of practitioner-dominated medical societies. In the 19th century, medical schools were generally run by small groups of doctors for their own financial benefit. During most of the 20th century, medical schools have been university controlled and responsive to the interest of foundations, and since World War I, government funding sources. For a brief period, from about 1900 to World War I, science-oriented medical schools and the AMA joins forces to press for the acceptance of scientific medicine. Since that time, they have gone their separate ways, the AMA struggling to preserve the dominance and the incomes of private practitioners, and medical schools fostering more rationalized medical care, usually with physicians as top management. Hospitals, insurance companies, and medical schools all have a relatively greater interest than doctors in promoting capital-intensive, rationalized medical care. While expanding medical technology helped doctors increase their status and incomes, it has been the raison d'etre of hospitals, medical schools, and even insurance companies. Medical technology's demands for heavy capital investment also encourage rationalization of medical resources, centralization and coordination of capital, facilities, expenditures, income, and personnel. Foundations and the state. Besides these interest groups, two other forces, the government and foundations, have exerted a powerful influence in favor of rationalizing medical care. Although the government has been the dominant influence since World War II, foundations were the major external influence on American medicine in its formative period from 1900 to 1930. Their source of power has been the purse, generously but carefully applied to specific programs and policies. Neither foundations nor the government has operated as an interest group in the manner of doctors, hospitals, insurance companies, medical schools, and the drug and hospital supplies industries. The enormous sums they expanded from foundations, some $300 million from 1910 through the 1930s, and from the federal government, many billions of dollars since World War II for medical research and education alone, have not been for their own financial enrichment. The argument developed and supported in this book suggests that both foundation policy and government policy have served the interests of certain medical groups, but only because the interests of these groups coincided with those of the larger corporate class. As evidence from the historical record will show, the programs of the foundations earlier in this century were explicitly intended to develop and strengthen institutions that would extend the reach and tighten the grasp of capitalism throughout the society. In medicine, the major objectives of foundations were to develop a system of medicine that would be supportive of capitalist society, and to rationalize medical care to make it accessible to those whom it was supposed to reach, but at the least cost to society's resources. These objectives created their own contradictions. At first, foundations aligned themselves with the aims and strategies of the medical profession, but they soon rejected the narrow interests the profession wished to serve and moved quickly to expand the roles of medical schools and hospitals and to support their dominance over all medical care. By World War II, when the role of the state in governing the capitalist economy was fully established, the federal government took over the foundation's leading role in the medicine, continuing the basic strategy adopted by the foundations more than 2 decades earlier, and opening the floodgates of the Treasury to implement it. In the first chapter, we will see how philanthropic foundations emerged from several parallel developments of capitalist society in the latter 19th century. While many members of the new wealthy class were supporting charities to ameliorate the disruptions and deprivations imposed on large numbers of people by capitalist industrialization, others recognized the need for technically trained professionals and managers and supported the development of universities and professional science. Just after the turn of the century, men of great wealth, like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, created philanthropic foundations with professional managers in charge of their charitable fortunes. With the Rockefeller philanthropies in the lead, these foundations developed strategic programs to legitimize the fundamental social structure of capitalist society and to provide for its technical needs. Chapter 2 traces the social and economic role of scientific medicine and the history of the American medical profession. Throughout this book, capitalized state refers to the political institutions and agencies of government which embody society's political authority. Uncapitalized state refers to the individual states in the United States. Modern scientific medicine was not merely a natural outcome of combining science and medicine in the 19th century. Apart from the concrete scientific developments that permitted the application of scientific thought and investigation to problems of disease, scientific medicine had equally important social and economic origins. It was an essential part of a strategy articulated by reform leaders of the medical profession to enhance the profession's position in society, and it succeeded because it won the support of dominant segments of the American class structure. Scientific medicine gained the support of American medical profession in the late 19th century because it met the economic and social needs of physicians. By giving doctors greater technical credibility in society, it saved them from the ignominious position to which the profession had sunk. Moreover, science medicine became an ideological tool by which the dominant regular segment of the profession restricted the production of new doctors, overcame the medical sects, temporarily united leading medical school faculty and practitioners, and otherwise reduced competition. Despite its appeal for the medical profession, scientific medicine would have accomplished little for doctors if it had not had the support of dominant groups in American society. In Chapter 3, we will see the reasons for this capitalist support, especially through the thinking of Frederick T. Gates, for more than 2 decades the chief philanthropic and financial lieutenant to John D. Rockefeller, and the architect of the major Rockefeller medical philanthropies. Just a side note, because I know what you're thinking, Frederick T. Gates is not related to the current Billy Gates, who has been elected world leader, for basically all health policy. So it'd be great if he was, because that would be a great point in history to go back to the point to. But I did look into it because I was thinking that myself, and it is confirmed that he is not related to him, according to the internet. Back to the book. As an explanation of the causes, prevention and cure of disease that was strikingly similar to the worldview of industrial capitalism, scientific medicine won the support of the classes associated with the rise of corporate capitalism in America. Capitalism and corporate managers believed that scientific medicine would improve the health of society's workforce and thereby increase productivity. They also embraced scientific medicine as an ideological weapon in their struggle to formulate a new culture appropriate to and supportive of industrial capitalism. They were drawn to the profession's formulation of medical theory and practice that exonerated capitalism's vast inequities and its reckless practices that shorten the lives of members of the working class. That's actually a pretty interesting parallel based on what's happening as well today. They embrace scientific medicine as an ideological weapon in their struggle to formulate a new culture appropriate to and supportive of industrial capitalism. Interesting. Thus, scientific medicine served the interests of both the dominant medical profession and the corporate class in the United States. Nevertheless, a contradiction emerged between the interests of the medical profession and those of the corporate class. As we will see in Chapter 4, the private practice profession and the corporate class clashed over attempts to reform medical education. The financing of scientific medical schools required tremendous amounts of capital from the outside the medical profession. Those who provided the capital had the leverage to impose policy. The lines of the conflict were clearly drawn. Was medical education to be controlled by and to serve the needs of medical practitioners, or was it to serve the broader needs of the capitalist society and to be controlled by corporate class institutions? I think we have our answer now in regards to that question. The Flexner Report, sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation, tried to unify these interests by centering its attacks on crassly commercial medical schools. However, the Rockefeller philanthropies, substantially directed by Gates, exposed the contradiction by forcing a full-time clinical faculty system on recipient schools against the interests and arguments of private practitioners. Gates made it clear that medicine must serve capitalist society and be controlled through the medical schools and reproduce its professional personnel and innovate its technique by capitalist foundations and capitalist universities. By 1929, one Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, had itself appropriated more than $78 million to medical schools to implement this strategy, and Gates's perspective was firmly established. Gates was adamant about keeping his strategy free of involvement of the state by not giving money to state university medical schools. However, within the Rockefeller philanthropies, as within the largest industrial and financial corporations generally, most officers and directors had come to see the state as a necessary aid in rationalizing industries, markets, and institutions. The course that Gates and his contemporaries initiated continued to develop during the next half-century, but with the state assuming the dominant financial and political role in rationalizing medical care and developing medical technology. As we will see in Chapter 5, the state's emphasis on technological medicine ignored some of the most important determinants of disease and death, while the economic and political forces of capitalist society assured that rationalization would not eliminate the developing corporate ownership and control over the medical market. I'm going to read that one more time. The course that Gates and his contemporaries initiated continued to develop during the next half-century, but with the state assuming the dominant financial and political role in rationalizing medical care and developing medical technology. As we will see in Chapter 5, the state's emphasis on technological medicine ignored some of the most important determinants of disease and death, while the economic and political forces of capitalist society assured that rationalization would not eliminate the developing corporate ownership and control over the medical market. How medicine will be contained and rationalized in this private market system is a contradiction that now plagues the state and the corporate class as the demand for national health insurance grows. How medical resources can be transformed into effective instruments for improving the population's health is a contradiction imposed on the entire society. These contradictions and their resulting crises are the legacy of medicine's development in capitalist society.